Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast.
This government has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
U.S. President John F. Kennedy addressed his nation as, for 13 days in 1962, the United States and Soviet Union stood at the precipice of mutual nuclear annihilation. Historians say the Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest this world has come to nuclear war. An arms race accelerated in the decades that followed, with the number of nuclear warheads skyrocketing to more than 70,000 by the mid-1980s. That race continued until 1991, when, in an historic ceremony at the Kremlin, George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as START.
To President Gorbachev and members of the Soviet government, the treaty that we signed today is a most complicated one, governing the most serious of concerns. Its 700 pages stand as a monument to several generations of U.S. and Soviet negotiators, and it represents a major step forward for our mutual security and the cause of world peace.
That treaty saw deep cuts and strict limits to U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals. It was followed by the new START treaty in 2010, which further limited nuclear warheads by almost 30%. That agreement, the last nuclear weapons treaty between those two superpowers, expired overnight. Thomas Countryman is a former U.S. diplomat and served as acting undersecretary of state for arms control and international security. He's now board chair of the Arms Control Association. It's a nonpartisan organization, and he is in Washington, D.C. Thomas Countryman, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I grew up in the 1980s under the cloud of nuclear annihilation. People might remember that TV show, The Day After, which scared the hell out of us. 100 million people apparently watched that show. It was about what would happen if nuclear war were to unfold. What was the threat that nuclear weapons posed in the 1980s and beyond?
Well, the same threat that they pose today, that is an all-out thermonuclear war between the United States and Russia, would not only end civilization, it could potentially end the existence of humans as a species. What happened between the 1960s and today is that the Cuban Missile Crisis caused both Kennedy and Khrushchev to begin a 60-year-long process of trying to reduce that risk. No matter what else Washington and Moscow were arguing about, we could reduce the risk of nuclear weapons use. And for more than 50 years, they succeeded. As you noted, we reduced the number of weapons in the world from more than 70,000 down to about 12,000 today. And that's success of diplomatic negotiations. But today, the risk that these weapons could be used for the first time since 1945 is, in my opinion, and that of many other people in the field, the highest risk it's been since 1962 for a number of reasons. And that's why we watch with alarm as this treaty expires.
That's chilling to hear. And again, the numbers tell the story in some ways when it comes to the reductions that took place under START 1 and the new START treaty. How is it possible that an agreement like this just expires overnight?
Well,
that's a big sigh before you answer that question.
Yes, there's a number of reasons for it. To give a charitable interpretation, President Trump and the people around him seem to believe that there is now an opportunity for a better arms control treaty, one that involves China as well.
That's what Donald Trump said. Donald Trump said, these are his words, if it expires, it expires. We'll do a better agreement.
Yeah, it's kind of a interesting attitude to have towards an agreement. Look, it is important for the future that China be included in arms control agreements. At this moment, China has about 600 warheads as compared to about 4,000 each for the United States and Russia. And so China does not see a reason to be engaged in these until the U.S. and Russia make further reductions. I would like to see China involved, but it doesn't just happen by putting out on social media, we want a trilateral treaty. What is necessary at the moment is for the U.S. to get back to regular negotiation with Russia, which really hasn't happened in the last 4 years, and to begin a process of discussion with China. Not negotiation, because China is not ready for that, but discussions with China about our common security interests. I just don't see that initiative coming from the Trump administration.
You were the acting U.S. Undersecretary of State for Arms Control in 2017, and then you were suddenly removed from that role. And I ask you what happened in part because I think it helps explain some of your thoughts on the current Trump administration.
Well, at the beginning of the first Trump term in 2017, I was removed from my post along with several other senior officials in what was then an unprecedented purge of senior leadership. Nothing like the whole-scale purge that we saw of the State Department last year. No one ever explained to me why I was on that list, but in some ways I think it was a signal that in a new, more hyper-masculine administration, arms control is simply not something that real men do. That attitude, to an extent, carries over into this second Trump term, where there is no focus on expertise, there is no focus on actually having discussions. There's a focus on taking strong masculine positions on social media and in public announcements instead of actually doing something.
That's a wild thing. I just have to acknowledge, it's a wild thing to say, that arms control is not something that real men do.
I think that is an attitude that you can find among those in the administration, although there are very few actual experts on the topic in the current administration, and among those organizations that support the administration. That's totally different to what the last 10 presidents have believed. Arms control is not something you do for its own sake. It's not a concession to enemies. It's not virtue signaling. Arms control is national security, and it is the most cost-effective and safest form of national security. We'll see if there's anybody in the current administration who believes that, but they haven't put their head above the parapet yet. Just
as we're talking, Axios is reporting that the United States and Russia are closing in on a deal to continue to observe this expiring arms control treaty beyond its expiration as of this morning. Does that give you some reassurance? I mean, at the very least, that they're agreeing to let this thing kind of continue for a period of time.
Yes, which is a step that they could have taken any time in the last 5 months. But if they take it today, that's fine. I would note it does not have to be a formal agreement. It can simply be a handshake between the two sides that says we are not going to upload additional warheads as long as you don't upload additional warheads. That gives some breathing space to actually begin the process of talking to each other, which has not occurred in these first 13 months of the Trump term.
You mentioned foreign policy being dictated by social media in some ways. On Truth Social last October, President Trump said he directed his Department of War, as he calls it, to resume nuclear testing for the first time since 1992. Where does that leave, and I say us in the world?
Yeah. Well, if he follows through on that, and it is not at all clear that he understood what he was talking about, then it would set back the cause of reducing nuclear risk. No country in the world has done nuclear testing in this century except North Korea. U.S., Russia, China, and others have observed a voluntary testing moratorium since the 1990s. And to break out of that moratorium, if the U.S. does it first, would be an own goal by the U.S. The U.S. knows not only has the most data on nuclear testing because we did more testing than all other countries combined. We have the most knowledge about how nuclear weapons work. And testing is a way to allow every other country, not just China and Russia, but India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, to catch up and to develop more dangerous weapons. So it would be a foolish thing to do. I am glad that so far there has been no action taken towards what he expressed in that post.
I have to let you go. We're out of time. But you said that we are in a very dangerous time. You believe that this is one of the most dangerous times since, or if not the most dangerous time for this world since the 1960s.
It's dangerous not only because there are more conflicts around the world that could escalate unintentionally into nuclear use, not only because the risk of false alarms that could instigate a nuclear attack has not gone away, but also because we have leaders that very few people trust to do the right thing in a crisis. 9 men who have their finger on a nuclear button, several of whom believe that they are not just the supreme leader of their country, but the smartest man in history. When you have that kind of power concentrated among those kind of men, I think the risk is higher than what we have seen in the last 60 years.
Use that word again. It's a bracing conversation. Thomas Countryman, good to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Thomas Countryman is a board chair of the Arms Control Association, former U.S. diplomat. We are, as he said, closer than ever to our own destruction, and that's according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Last week, their doomsday clock ticked the closest it's ever been to midnight. Matt Korda is Associate Director of the Nuclear Information Project with the Federation of American Scientists. He's in Toronto. Matt, good morning to you.
Morning, Matt.
That clock says
Thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you here. The clock says we're, 85 seconds to midnight?
Yep, that's right. This is the closest that we have ever been, right? According to the scientists who move that clock forward to nuclear catastrophe.
What does that mean, that we're 85 seconds away to midnight?
It means that, the news today is all about New START, but New START is really sort of a broader casualty in a deteriorating relationship between the nuclear superpowers, right? This is, we're talking about 9 countries with more than 12,000 nuclear warheads between them, and really a different situation, a fundamentally different situation than we had during the Cold War, where it was just, a couple countries with, granted many thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, but a relatively simple deterrence dynamic between those countries. Today, when we're talking about 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and, these countries are led by, for the most part, men who are very emotional, very instinctual, and surrounded by information systems that are prone to disinformation. What you get with that is a situation in which a nuclear crisis that affects just one country or 2 countries gradually and very, potentially quite quickly expanding into a crisis involving 4, 5, 6 different nuclear armed states. And so these crises can spiral out of control, quite quickly.
That's why you describe this as a 9-body problem in some ways. I mean, despite the fact that the United States and Russia have 90% of the stockpile, that there are other actors involved here.
Exactly, right? You could imagine a situation, right, in which, the United States and Russia, without this treaty, are thinking about uploading additional warheads onto their stockpiles. How is a country like China going to react to that? And when we think about China in recent years has had conflicts with India. How is India going to react to that? And then how will Pakistan react to that, right? There's a chain reaction that happens now whenever one country does something with its nuclear weapons.
It's not just those 9 nations. You wrote that we are entering an age when nuclear weapons can expand rapidly, and the nations that have nuclear weapons can expand rapidly. Tell me more about that and who might enter that club.
Yeah, so, there are other countries out there that are increasingly thinking about wanting to acquire nuclear weapons for their own security. And we're seeing this, there's kind of a spectrum of rhetoric that we've seen where some countries, or whether it's just some leaders or retired officials, that are pointing out that, quote unquote, nuclear weapons might be valuable tools. And whereas, you have on the other side of the spectrum, countries that are actually very serious and have the capability. They've been sort of hedging for quite some time. And it's really just sort of a political decision to move over that threshold rather than a technical one. What we're seeing sort of overall is that the message that's being sort of imbued into these countries is that nuclear weapons are useful for security. The challenge with this type of rhetoric is that it's not that we can just sort of snap our fingers and acquire nuclear weapons and then suddenly, our country will be safe, right? Nuclear weapons come with a variety of challenges of their own, right? That include harms to domestic populations. It's a ton of money and time and resources, and in many ways can also sometimes trigger the exact security situation that you're hoping to avoid by acquiring nuclear weapons. And so it's not as simple as we might think.
But do you take those comments seriously when you have Germany suggesting this, when you have the leading paper in Sweden saying nobody wants to talk about Swedish nuclear weapons, but we must? Or you have the former Canadian Chief of Defence Staff, Wayne Eyre, saying that Canada should, in his words, keep our options open. Do you take those comments seriously?
I do take them seriously, not necessarily because I think, a country like Canada is going to acquire nuclear weapons tomorrow, but it really is a sort of pattern of sort of a broader rhetoric about the value of nuclear weapons. And I do think that, this sort of perceived value of nuclear weapons is missing some nuance. And so it does worry me that we are in a situation where, high profile leaders are talking about, how important it is to get nuclear weapons and not talking about the perceived consequences that would come, when those nuclear weapons actually arrive.
And one of those consequences, again, you've hinted at this, is that if there are more of those weapons, then if you have more knives, you might get cut. That the next nuclear crisis could start by accident. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, when we have more nuclear weapons, it means that there are more systems of control that are built around those weapons, right? More countries that have them means that you have to have, different types of delivery systems. You have to have, people that plan how they get used. You have to have decision making that gets typically centralized in the hands of a single person. And when you're building up an entire ecosystem around nuclear weapons, it means that there are that many more vectors in which something can go wrong. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, you don't want anything to go wrong, right? You want these things to work when they have to work and then not work when they're not supposed to, right? And so you are in a situation when, more countries are building nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons are getting expanded, with the arsenals that already exist, in which more of these systems of control are being put in place. And when you have when you imbue an authoritarianism onto those systems, as many countries that have them have, then, you're more likely to have things go wrong, more likely to have disinformation, misinformation, that sort of thing.
We're almost out of time. I just have a minute or so left. I, again, grew up at a time when there was, no nukes protests. There was public outcry that helped play a role in some ways in ending the Cold War arms race. You have a treaty that just quietly expires, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation. Why aren't we seeing that kind of public protest now?
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, right? Because, there are so many other things that are happening in the world, right? And people are, I think, they are thinking about nuclear weapons as a problem that is older, right? A problem that is sort of a relic of the Cold War. Many folks, when I talk to them about nuclear weapons, they treat them with a sense of fatalism that they're, not really sure how many countries have them. It's not something that I think a lot of our political leaders are particularly well educated on. This, I think, is a challenge, right? Because, during the Cold War, you had politicians, community leaders, that sort of thing, who were extremely tapped into the debate about nuclear weapons and were able to sort of speak with a lot of knowledge about why these things are bad, why they make us less safe, and why money that's being used to support them, could instead be diverted to other sorts of things that would make people safer. And we don't really have that anymore. Politicians instead, a lot of them are more interested in sort of using nuclear weapons as a tool of manipulating risk and to sort of blame and shame their prospective arms control partners rather than actually trying to work towards something that would make the world safer.
Matt, good to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Matt Korda is Associate Director of the Nuclear Information Project with the Federation of American Scientists. You've been listening to The Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.